What is going on, guys? My name is Aaron, and this is the Game Day Hour. Welcome back to our final episode of our fantasy football division review. And of course, we're looking at the AFC West, which consists of the Arizona Cardinals, the Seattle Seahawks, the Los Angeles Rams, and the Super Bowl contending San Francisco 49ers. So we're going to be looking at 26 players, 6 from the Cardinals, 8 from the Seahawks, 6 from the Rams, and 6 from the Niners. We're going to see where they are relative to their fantasy position, where we would draft them if we were to draft them based on our tier list. So, without further ado, let's get started. Also, I do want to note that this video is coming out the day after the Hall of Fame game. So the NFL season is back. I'll talk a little bit more about what our schedule is going to look like going into the season. So stay tuned for then. Anyways, let's get into today's episode. All right, we are in the tier list maker, and now we are going to be starting with the Arizona Cardinals. So between 5 fantasy players for the Cardinals last year, they scored a total of 586 total fantasy points. That's 36 points, 63 points per week. And among 5 players, that's 7.33 points per player. Down in the middle, despite them being a horrendous team overall last season. So to be fair, Kyler Murray was out for a little bit. We're going to start with Kyler Murray. Kyler Murray last season had 1,799 passing yards, along with 244 rushing yards, 13 touchdowns, and 5 interceptions. That's 160 fantasy points, which was 27th among all quarterbacks. So remember, the Cardinals started off with Joshua Dobbs before he went over to Minnesota. So Kyler Murray came in somewhere from the halfway point, maybe a little bit more. I am not completely sure where he came in. All I know is he came in and he did show glimpses of just being spectacular. But still, there's a lot of question marks with Kyler Murray. Overall, Kyler Murray is a really good fantasy quarterback when he has a full season. The problem with Murray and the Arizona offense is that they start really hot generally, but then they slow down towards the end of the year. So Kyler Murray for me is still probably around 6 through 9 because of his versatility, but his availability and the fact that he starts to slow down towards the end of the year makes him not a top 5 quarterback. But because he has all these assets and now he has some better receivers potentially, he can be somewhere in this middle guard. That's where I could draft him, but we're just gonna have to wait and see. He's still somebody valuable to have at the quarterback position. Maybe not as a starter, but as a good backup. Next up, we have James Conner. James Conner last season had 1,040 rushing yards and 9 total touchdowns. That's 164 fantasy points, 15th among all running backs. He's very consistent with Arizona and has always been a really good running back. James Conner, I would say he doesn't fit in the top 2 rounds because there's a lot of running backs that are sitting in there projected. But I do think 3 through 5, you could make an argument that he is up there, and I wouldn't blame you. I think that James Conner, he does a lot for that Cardinals offense, which doesn't do a lot for itself. So Conner here, 3 through 5, maybe 4 is where I'd see people zoning in on him, but we'll just have to wait and see. Next up, we have rookie Marvin Harrison Jr. At Ohio State in his last season, he had 1,211 receiving yards and 15 total touchdowns. He was the first wide receiver to go off the board at number 4, and he is one of the most hyped receivers. Obviously, he's coming from Marvin Harrison Sr., who, played many years with the Colts, won a Super Bowl. Marvin Harrison Jr. is definitely somebody who I would potentially draft. As a matter of fact, he's up here. A lot of the wide receivers that have been on here as rookies that I would draft normally sit at 10 through 15. But since Marvin Harrison is the number 1 wide receiver on this list and he's super talented, 6 through 9 seems like a very fair spot to have him. I wouldn't draft him higher. There's just a lot more I'm going to have to see before I would draft him higher. But 6 through 9 with Kyler Murray, it's a pretty good spot. Next up, we have Michael Wilson. He's kind of a younger player. He had 565 receiving yards and 3 total touchdowns. That's 70 fantasy points, which was 57th among all receivers. Obviously, he's kind of getting a bump up because he wasn't the number 2 last year. He's still going to go undrafted for most fantasy leagues, but maybe we'll see some production from him or a little bit more. He just has to get somewhere around 700, 800 yards potentially for me to want to draft him. But for now, he's undraftable. Next up, we have Trey McBride, the tight end. He had 825 receiving yards and 3 total touchdowns. That's 94 fantasy points, which is actually 9th among all tight ends. Tight end 1, tight end 2. He's probably going to be right here. I don't have a lot of information on this guy. All I know is that being 9th among tight ends is pretty valuable if you're in a league with tight ends, of course. My league, you don't have to have a tight end, so I probably wouldn't draft him, but in your leagues that do have tight ends, he is probably like a tight end 2, roughly. So 10 through 15 is probably where I'd get him. Lastly, we have the Cardinals defense. They had 98 fantasy points, which was second to last among all defenses. So outside of Budda Baker, this defense does not sway me in any way. So they're going to go undrafted, in my opinion. I mean, Arizona's defense, they had some bright points. Obviously, my Cowboys can only score 16 points against them, so there was that. But other than that, they're probably undrafted. So, as we look at the Arizona Cardinals, James Conner is in between 3 through 5. Kyler Murray and Marvin Harrison Jr. are 6 through 9. McBride is 10 through 15. And Michael Wilson and the defense are probably going to go undrafted. With that said, let's move on to the team with the most players to look at, the Seattle Seahawks. The Seahawks last season had 1,014 fantasy points combined. Through 16 weeks of fantasy football, that's 63.38 points per week. And they, among players, that's 8 players, 7.92 points per player, which is a little bit above average, I would say. I mean, the Seahawks have a lot of playmakers, so let's get into this. First up, we have Geno Smith. Geno Smith has been with the Seahawks for a little bit. He's been the starter for like 3 years, and he went from being one of the biggest busts in NFL history to an actual compatible great quarterback. At least for fantasy reason, he's been incredible. He's gotten the Seahawks to the playoffs once, so he does have some, good upside to him now. Last season, he had 3,624 passing yards, along with 21 touchdowns and 9 interceptions. That's 261 fantasy points, 18th among quarterbacks, so QB2 range. That's still pretty draftable. Geno has a lot of weapons, which makes him super valuable. I would say, in many cases, Geno Smith could be drafted in 6 through 9. I wouldn't put him down here because I do think there's a lot of value to the weapons he also has, along with putting up a lot of stats. Be able to play a full season, he could potentially do some damage for the Seahawks. So I'd put him here. I don't know if I would personally draft him, but maybe. And this was probably where I'd see him being drafted. Next up, we have Kenneth Walker III. Now, I've had Kenneth Walker on my team at least twice in the 2 years he's been in the league. Walker's good, but I've never really kept him on my team, and I should because he can provide a lot of value. For Walker, he has 905 rushing yards along with 259 receiving yards, 9 total touchdowns. That's 158 fantasy points, which is 17th among all running backs. So that's running back 2 range. I wonder what he'd be like if he was the bell cow. I think he'd be higher because he's had games where he's just straight up exploded. I think that Kenneth Walker overall would probably be with Geno Smith in round 6 through 9 because he shares the backfield with the next guy we're going to be talking about. And so if he were a bell cow, he'd probably be higher, maybe even breaking into the first 2 rounds. But since he's not, 6 through 9 is kind of where I would have him. Next up, we have, excuse me if I pronounce his name incorrectly, Zach Charbonnet, I think is how you pronounce his name. Last season, he had 462 rushing yards, 209 receiving yards, and only 1 touchdown. That's 61 fantasy points, which was 47th among all running backs. But I have seen him on other teams in fantasy, so he is somebody who I would say is undraftable, but he is somebody who is often at the top of free agency. So he's one of these type of players. He's not going to be drafted in most cases, but free agency, he's going to be towards the top, relatively. So I think if he gets more touches, he could probably put up more statistics, more fantasy points. But if they start to lean on Kenneth Walker, then, which I think they should do, I would probably put him in undrafted. Next up, we have DK Metcalf. Now, Metcalf has been the number 1 for a little while now. I mean, one of the most, how should I say, He's built like a tank. And he's always been good with the Seahawks, but he's had down seasons. But last season wasn't a down year. He had 1,114 receiving yards along with 8 touchdowns. That's 152 fantasy points, 15th among all receivers. So that's wide receiver 2 range. I think that DK Metcalf could be drafted in the round 5s. I would say 5 is kind of his like dead zone. I think that DK Metcalf provides so much for Geno Smith and his offense. I mean, he's the big-time player, so he's going to get in the end zone very often. I just think that he should probably take on that wide receiver 1 role a little bit more. He shares it a lot with Tyler Lockett and Jackson Smith-Jigba, so I think that DK Metcalf is 3 through 5. He could be higher, but I just think this is where he's going to zone in most of the time. Next up, we have Tyler Lockett. He's always in the mix with the Seahawks. He had 894 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns. That's 113 fantasy points. That's 33rd among all receivers. Despite being in the wide receiver 3-4 range, I still would probably see a lot of people drafting him in the 6 through 9, maybe very late. But I don't know. I feel... the more I think about it, I'll probably put Geno to be drafted higher than Marvin Harrison. But Tyler Lockett, to me, he's always going to put up great points, but he's so in the middle of the pack because he's the wide receiver 2. So we're going to have to see what happens, but this is probably where I'd have Tyler Lockett. Next up is Jackson Smith-Jigba, the wide receiver 3. He had 628 receiving yards, 4 touchdowns. That's 81 fantasy points. That's 51 among all receivers, but I do think he's going to take a leap. I'd see a lot of cases where he could be drafted extremely late as a wide receiver 4. I think in many other cases he would go undrafted, but because I can see him being in this range, he's going to be placed right here. He has a lot of upside that you're just going to have to wait and see. Late pick, but still probably draftable. Next up, we have Noah Fant. He had 414 receiving yards and no touchdowns. That's 35 fantasy points. That was 33rd among all tight ends. So as much as I think he's still somebody relatively draftable, I'm going to say he goes undrafted for the most part, maybe a high tight end, because there's just so many more weapons now that the tight end position is probably going to go unnoticed in Seattle, but we're going to have to wait and see. Lastly, we have the Seahawks defense. They had 148 fantasy points. That's 22nd among all defenses, and they have lost some pieces, but they still have a pretty decent secondary. I'm going to say that they could be drafted, but very, very late draft pick. They're just teetering on being undrafted, being drafted late. So I'm going to put them right here and give them the benefit of the doubt. So we have no Seahawks in the rounds 1 through 2, but DK Metcalf is somewhere around like round 5. Geno Smith, Kenneth Walker, and Tyler Lockett are 6 through 9s. Jackson Smith-Jigba and the defense are like 10 through 15, very late though. And Charbonnet and the tight end Noah Fant are going to relatively go undrafted. But now it's time to move on to the Los Angeles Rams. Among 6 players last year, the Rams put up 958 total points. That's 59.88 points per week. That's 9.98 points per player. So the Rams have a very high-octane fantasy gold spot for them. And we're going to start off with their quarterback, Matthew Stafford. Stafford is on the older side of things, of course. Last season, he had 3,965 passing yards, along with 24 touchdowns and 11 interceptions. Among fantasy players, he had 281 fantasy points, 16th among all quarterbacks. Matthew Stafford is still somebody worth drafting, and I'd probably see him being drafted around 6 through 9. I think that because he's getting older, that it's going to be harder to draft him up here. The only reason why he'd be drafted earlier is because he does have a dominant wide receiver core. But if we're looking at age and looking at that regard, I'd probably put him in the middle rounds here. Man, we got 3 quarterbacks back-to-back. Kyler Murray, Geno Smith, and Matthew Stafford. They can go interchangeably whenever you want to draft them, but this is where I'd probably see him being drafted. Next up, we have Kyren Williams. What a shocker he was. Now, I love Kyren Williams. Notre Dame grad, of course. He was amazing for us when he was playing at Notre Dame, especially that 2020 year. He was incredible. Kyren Williams last season for the Rams had 1,144 rushing yards, 206 receiving yards, 15 total touchdowns, and 216 fantasy points. That was 3rd among all running backs. He came out of the shadows. You had these other 2 running backs. I can't even remember their names. They've never really been known for their running backs. It's really been receiver game with Cooper Kupp in them. We have something new with Kyren Williams. He is very valuable as a running back, and I think that, I don't know if he's going to go in the first round, but I think the second round is a good place to zone in on him because they leaned on him heavy, and he produced very well. I knew he was going to be a great running back. I'm just glad that the Rams gave him a chance, and I think he is going to be our first two-round player to be drafted high. He's probably not going to be the only Ram there. Next up, we have Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp, I'm pretty sure, was a little bit injured last season. He had 737 receiving yards and 5 total touchdowns. That's 99 fantasy points, 40th among all wide receivers. But if he plays fully, I think that Cooper Kupp is probably going to be drafted in, I'd say this range. He does go down a little bit from being the #1 overall pick, mostly in a lot of fantasy leagues a couple years ago, and that's mostly because his availability has started to become a little shattered, and the other wide receiver on this list. But Cooper Kupp, 3 through 5. Next up, we have it's going to be a sophomore this year, but last year the rookie sensation, Puka Nacua. Puka had 1,486 receiving yards, which is the all-time record now among rookies for most receiving yards in a rookie season. He also had 6 touchdowns. That's 183 fantasy points, 6th among all wide receivers. Puka is probably one that is going to be drafted a late first-round pick. Because I think that even though he's the wide receiver 2 on the depth chart, he's probably going to be treated as the wide receiver 1. So I think he's going to be a highly drafted pick. And man, just look at the Rams. The Rams have so far showed a big difference. Stafford is the lowest pick, and he's in the 6 through 9s. Next up, we have Tyler Higbee. Higbee had 495 receiving yards along with 2 touchdowns. 55 fantasy points, that's 22nd among all tight ends. That's just teetering on being drafted. So same deal with Trey McBride. I think that Higbee is probably going to be drafted in the rounds 10 through 15, mostly because there's not a lot of use for the tight end game when you have 2 wide receivers who are top 5 draft picks. So you got to give it to the Rams. Their receiving core is amazing, but Higbee for now is going to be through 10 through 15. Next up, we have the Rams defense. Last year they had 124 fantasy points, and they were 29th among all defenses. Aaron Donald's gone, Jalen Ramsey's moved on, so they don't really have a lot there. Their defense is going to be the one weak spot to where I say they go undrafted, because they need to rebuild that defense just a little bit more. They've lost a lot of pieces. So yeah, that's going to finish off the Rams. Puka Nacua and Kyren Williams are top 2 round picks. Cooper Kupp is in 3 through 5. Matthew Stafford 6 through 9. Tyler Higbee 10 through 15, and the defense goes undrafted. And now, the Super Bowl contending San Francisco 49ers. Get this. The Niners, among 6 players that we're looking at, had 1,303 total fantasy points. That's 81.44 points per week, 13.57 per player. That's the best we've seen so far since we actually started to do this measurement halfway through our fantasy series. So this right now, if I'm not mistaken, is the highest fantasy offense. I think the only one that would probably compete would either be Philly, Dallas, or Miami, but San Francisco so far has the crown. And it all starts with Mr. Irrelevant, who everybody likes to overhate now, but I think is a star in this league, Brock Purdy. Brock Purdy last year had 4,280 passing yards along with 33 total touchdowns, 11 interceptions, and 347 fantasy points. 6th among all quarterbacks. So you can call him a game-managing quarterback if you like. He doesn't have to be a game changer. He's still a star because what he does very well with the pieces around him. Brock Purdy, to me, is going to be one of the quarterbacks drafted up here in 3 through 5. He's most likely going to be a quarterback 1 with just the sheer amount of weapons he has at his disposal. And one of those weapons is Christian McCaffrey. McCaffrey led the entire running back core in fantasy football. He was first among all running backs with 311 fantasy points. That's, if I'm looking at the math correctly, 36 less than Brock Purdy. Christian McCaffrey last year had 1,459 rushing yards, 564 receiving yards, and 21 total touchdowns. That's monstrous. And of course, in my opinion, even though there's wide receivers contending like Tyreek Hill, like Justin Jefferson or CeeDee Lamb, Christian McCaffrey to me is not only a top fantasy pick, but I believe in many cases he is the #1 overall pick. The only question mark behind McCaffrey is availability. At times, he used to be an injury machine. But if he stays fully healthy, he is going to give you a lot to work with. So yeah, he's going to be number one in many cases. So in my league, I'm going to highly doubt that anybody else goes anywhere else. So give McCaffrey the number one nod. Next, my English just turned off there. Next up, we have Deebo Samuel. 892 receiving yards, 225 rushing yards, 12 total touchdowns. That's 171 fantasy points, 9th among all wide receivers. Again, super talented. But because as for now, he shares the wide receiver core with another great wide receiver on this list. Deebo is probably going to be somewhere here in rounds 3 through 5, mostly because, come on, the man is a two-way player, great in the receiving game and also great in the rushing game. They just have so many moves for him. So he's going to be somewhere here, and it doesn't look like he's going anywhere. The person in question is Brandon Ayuk. Ayuk last year for the Niners had 1,342 receiving yards, 7 total touchdowns. He had 166 fantasy points, 5 less than Deebo, and he was 10th among all receivers. See, this is the tough part, because I was questioning whether I wanted to put Brandon Ayuk in this episode, but we have to discuss him. I mean, this is somebody who is going to probably be an incredible wide receiver, even if he's not for the Niners, for somebody else. But let's say he does stay with the Niners. He is somewhere here. I mean, you're probably going to draft Deebo more because he does more, but Ayuk is also just a really good wide receiver in general, and he is top 5 worthy in round picks. But if he goes, he could be higher depending on which team he goes to. He could be lower depending on which team he goes to. But let's say he manages to stay with the Niners get a deal done, or they put him on the franchise tag, he'd probably be right here for San Francisco. Next up, we have George Kittle. Kittle last year had 1,020 receiving yards, 6 total touchdowns. That's 128 fantasy points, 2nd among all tight ends, even over Travis Kelce. Just less than Sam Laporta. George Kittle, in a lot of cases, depending on the league, he'll probably be picked around 3 through 5. And that's because he just does so much for the Niners offense. A lot of cases he'll probably be here, but in some cases, in certain fantasy leagues, he's one of those tight ends that can be drafted up here. So 3 through 5 is a good spot to have him. In my league, he'd probably go lower because we don't need tight ends in our league based on the way things work. But in most other leagues, he's 3 through 5. And then lastly, we have the 49ers defense. The 49ers defense last year had 180 fantasy points. That's 8th among all defenses. They were my defense, and man, were they special. Them and the Jets last year, they're amazing. To me, they're going to be drafted up here. I mean, they're very highly valuable. They have Nick Bosa. They have Fred Warner. They just have so many pieces to them, and they look amazing. So the Niners defense, 6 through 9 is probably where I'd have them, which now ends that tirade for the Niners. Nobody lower than 10 through 15. So McCaffrey is 1 through 2, potentially the first overall pick in many leagues. Deebo Samuel, Brock Purdy, Brandon Ayuk, and George Kittle make up 3 through 5. And the Niners defense can get drafted as high as round 6. I'm pretty sure I drafted them in like round 6 or 7 in my draft. And of course, helped me win a championship. They put up 28 points in my championship game, so that was amazing. The Niners are well-rounded overall, and they still have a lot of depth in other places. I could have put in Elijah Mitchell. I could have put in Jawan Jennings. They just loaded to the pack, even having the best fullback in the league with Kyle Juszczyk. So, and the Niners overall, when you look at this, both San Francisco and the Los Angeles Rams are very high up there. The Seahawks have some valuable players, and the Cardinals do too. This is going to be a tough division, but right now I'm leaning Niners. Anyways, let's get to our outro. And that'll do it for today's episode. Before I go, I want to talk about what's going to happen from here on out, because this is the last fantasy football episode. Obviously, I'm going to have the episode when I show you my team. It'll probably be the same week I do my first ever predictions, but theoretically, we're going to have an episode where we're looking over all the Thursday night and Friday night football games, because based on how I release my episodes, I release them on Fridays. If I were to put a Thursday night prediction on a Friday episode, a lot of y'all would be thinking I'm cheating in the predictions, and I don't want people to think that. So I'm going to have an episode that's strictly predicting Thursday night and Friday night games. all the episodes from here on out, as the NFL season moves on, are generally going to be based on the Saturday, Sunday, and Monday night games. So that's just for your information. There's going to be a chance I put up an episode where I basically predict who I think is going to be in the college football playoffs, maybe even the top 25. If you want to see my top 25 stuff, then I would recommend following my shorts and maybe my TikToks. I tend to not really post much on TikTok because shorts is kind of easier to work with, and I can do a lot more on shorts and just have a better schedule there. Trying to move between the two for me is just, I'm not doing well in doing that. So I'm going to probably be doing a lot of that on shorts. So most of the top 25 I'll just reveal each week. So that's for your guys' information. The other episode I have, of course, is predicting who I think is going to win each division and go to the playoffs. I'm not going to be doing Super Bowl or playoff predictions until those happen. But those are the 3 episodes I want to get done prior to the NFL season. I definitely want the Thursday night, Friday night games, and the NFL predictions. But the college football one, that's up in the air. So stay tuned for that. Anyways, the NFL begins this Thursday with the Hall of Fame game with the Houston Texans and the Chicago Bears. So even though most of the starters won't play, I'm still going to watch that. Football's back, and I'm glad it's back because I was going to watch the Olympics, but I was not happy with that opening ceremony, so I'm probably not going to watch the Olympics. Anyways, NFL's nearly here. College football's almost here. I hope you guys have been playing NCAA 25. That's been dope. It's one of the best games so far this year. And yeah, that will basically do it. I thank you guys so much for watching today's episode. If you enjoyed, please leave a like, comment down below, and subscribe. Go follow me on all my social medias. I tend to post when episodes go out. Sometimes I've lacked there, but I need to do better. And yeah, be prepared for these next few episodes. And that'll do it for me. I hope you guys have a great day. Take care, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace out.